To kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the BioShock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your BioShock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of BioShock's lasting legacy, of course, are the little sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about, like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you not salt it?
There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of, like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where, like, where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is, that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Are you willing to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few. The press, and this sort of happens over and over again, the games press worried a ton about it and, like, wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose, that it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that, like, you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't, it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this, you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up. That we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them. Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not? Right. And people would tell us stories how, like, their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night. Right. And that's that's an interesting. That was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. Like, this little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it, who's an adult woman, and nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of, like, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were much more, should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say,
Yeah.
you know, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
Because that's usually the way life is, right?
Yeah.
It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that you know, were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, you know, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, you know, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, I mean, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of the, you know, once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, you know, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about sort of your slow descent into, you know, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And that's what, I mean, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic
Or
constraints.
just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not, you know...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
Yeah, and because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, you know, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with BioShock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It was really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. Right. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. You know, how difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Right. Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? I mean, this is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving Little Sisters. Although, I have a few friends that are. I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I mean, I don't know if that was more, you know, the game developer and them trying to see, you know, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people. Which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. You know, they kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the Little Sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. You know, the needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bed, bye, Mr. B. Hurry, hurry, Mr. Bubbles.